So what you're about to see in this video is the process that I went through to create the rough engine wiring harness for the V8. What I did was initially I took this piece of cardboard here, I laid out the Dodge V8 engine wiring harness from the donor vehicle, traced it, every run of every connector on here, full scale, and right where the connectors ended. So for example, the fuel injector here and here, where it broke off in the main harness, this is exactly where that injector connector ended. So once I did that, I pulled apart the TJ harness, took all the wiring loom off, and laid it out as close as I could to this layout right here on the cardboard as well. Now I didn't do the final full assembly of the harness on the cardboard like this. I did a rough assembly. I got all the connectors where they needed to be, added the ones that needed to be added, shortened some of them, lengthened some of them, and kind of just left it as a rough harness. And then once I had the engine in the Jeep, I put that rough harness on top of the engine and then finished all the wiring there so it could be as precise as possible. No connectors were too long, none were too short, and everything went where it needed to go, which I wasn't able to do with 100% certainty off of the vehicle. So we're going to cut to some actual footage of working on it right now, and this will be the bulk of the primary pre-wiring, the rough harness right now. The next video I'm going to do is kind of some tips and tricks, I guess, that I kind of learned and figured out as I went. So disassembling certain connectors, little interesting things that I found as I was disassembling the harnesses as to how Chrysler built them. And after that, the next video after that is going to be actually getting into some of the mechanical stuff, the fun stuff. This is all pretty boring, I know, but unfortunately it's a necessary evil with these swaps. So let's get going. I'm laying out the Durango harness on this piece of cardboard that I put on top of the plywood. I'm going to separate each connector and trace it out with a Sharpie, trace out the whole harness, and make sure I know where everything is, how it's supposed to be set up, and basically how everything goes together. So at that point I can de-loom it and not worry too much about having to get everything back where it was so it'll fit on the engine. So basically I'll trace this out, I'll take the loom off, then I'll put the TJ harness on here and try to make everything line up. And that should kind of act as a way to measure what sensors needs to be extended, which ones need to be shortened, and whatever else. So at this point I've got the TJ harness pinned up here, and most of the loom stripped off of it, at least the loom where there was multiple connections inside one piece of loom. So there was just one piece that went to a connector. I left a lot of that. The way you can see it's kind of laid out now. The point that I picked to base most of the length of these connections around is the C104 connector. So that's on the 4-cylinder engine. If you're looking straight in, you're standing in front of the grill looking at the firewall, that's on the left side of the engine, and that's approximately where I think the part of the harness that will go along in the, I guess, the valley between the valve cover and the intake on the intake manifold on the V8 is going to be. It's approximately where that split was on the factory harness, and so that's where I chose to set this first split right here. And from there it looked like the C103 connector is going to line up pretty well with this piece, or this, I guess, group of wires in the valley on the other side. So basically the way it sits now is the loom is totally stripped off of it. I went through just quickly the connectors that are on the TJ harness. I haven't spliced in anything from the Durango harness yet. I kind of separated those from side to side where they're going to need to be on which side of the engine and which part of the harness they'll need to be connected to. So that's basically where it sits right now. At the point where I'm starting to figure out what wires are going to need to be lengthened and what's going to need to be spliced in. A few connectors from the Durango harness were different than the TJ harness, so we'll see if I can de-pin the TJ connectors and use the same prongs or pins in the connector for the Durango harness. If not, I'll need to cut and splice the wires, but I would prefer not to have to do that. So looking at the list that I made of which sensors are the same and which ones are different, or which connectors are different, we get the engine coolant temperature sensor, the generator, the oil pressure sensor, the idle air control motor, and a few that need to be added. But of those four that are all different, looking at each individual connector, the prongs inside are only the same on the oil pressure sensor. So ideally what would happen with all of these is basically de-pin the connector, pull the prongs out with the factory wiring, and slide the prongs into the new connector. But the prongs are different style on between the connectors on the two harnesses on all except for the oil pressure sensor. And so that one we will be de-pinning and reconnecting to the other harness. And the other ones we'll just have to cut and splice the wires. But for the oil pressure sensor, I'll do that right now. But this is the connector that I took off of the TJ harness. So you can see it has 3 prongs in it, where the Dodge connector only has 2 prongs, but it's the same style of connector. So we'll be deleting 1 wire off of the connector. The first thing I'll do is strip back a little bit of the protective wrap that's over the wires. Should be enough right there. Now there's a retainer on the back of it. Use a small screwdriver to pop that off. The older the connector is, the more brittle it will be. There's a small slot right here, which it may be possible to get something in to pry it off with, but it seems to work best as just getting a screwdriver under. Not too worried about screwing this one up because the AC compressor clutch uses the same connector, so worst case I can use that one. Now there's a I guess a weatherproof component to this right here that will need to be pried out. It's very easy to pierce through it, so definitely using caution with this one. Just going to slowly pry it out a little bit at a time. Work the screwdriver around the edge. So with the insulation out of the way, the next thing I'll do is take off a second retainer that's on the front. It's the blue colored piece in contrast to the black connector. There's a small clip that holds that in place, which can be released by sliding a tool into the back side. It's hard to see with this light, but it's a small hole that will need to have a small tool slid into it. For that I have a wire terminal tool made by Leslie. Once that's inserted, use a flat screwdriver and pry the blue piece out. That's free. Now we can get at the actual connectors. What holds the pins in place are small plastic clips. There's one right here and one right here. These will need to be pushed that way to release the pin. So I'll grab one of the wires with one hand, put some pressure on the connector, on the back of the connector. Then I'll slide the Same tool in, and the connector is free from that terminal. Now with the terminal free, go ahead and remove the insulator. And then remove the backing piece. To reassemble the connector, I'll put the back retainer on first. Then I'll put the insulator on. Now I will slide the pins into the connector. And they're both snapped into place. I'll slide the insulator back into the connector. Put the backing plate back on. And I'll reinstall the blue retainer from the front. That just snaps into place. Now the oil pressure sensor, or sending unit, depending on what you want to call it, is converted to from the TJ harness to fit onto the Dodge sensor. Right now I'm working on freeing up the transmission connector off of the Durango donor harness. A few of the wires are going into other connectors that I'm going to deal with somehow, because the connectors that they're going to don't exist on the Wrangler harness. As you can see, I've kind of pulled it free, mostly from the mess that's on the floor here. Just getting more and more knotted the more I work with it. So on this one, I pretty much started at the end where the connector is, and it mostly pulled free. It wasn't tangled around too many other wires, so that worked out nicely. And I just put a piece of electrical tape around every 2 feet or so as I was pulling it, just to keep the wires a little more recognizable in the mess. Right here, I ended up having to clip the ground off of where it tied into a bunch of other ground wires, so that'll be tied into the Wrangler harness somewhere. I'll have to splice and solder that one. Keep going. You can see where everything's depinned from the primary connector that goes into the PCM. So I labeled each one. Should be easy enough to figure out looking at a wiring diagram, because all the wires are obviously color coded, but just to make it easier, I just wrote whatever port they came out of on the terminal, and a lot of them had 5-word names, and I just wrote the first letter of each word to make it, again, easier to quickly tell what wire goes to what. Most of the wires for the transmission connector went right into the PCM connector, except for one that goes into this C105 connector, which goes off somewhere in the Durango. I'm not too sure. So basically it's the wire that goes to a relay. So this wire was plugged into the connector in the PCM, and then it comes down and goes up through this plug, goes to a relay out here somewhere, then it comes back as this red wire. And there's no connector like this that I can find on the TJ, so I'm just going to have to probably run this wire directly from the PCM to the underhood fuse box, and I'll put another relay in there for that. Then I'll run the red wire right from that back into the harness here. So I'm going to disconnect the red wire and the pink wire that runs to the PCM, and that will complete disconnecting the automatic transmission part of the harness. It's definitely a little early for a punch list, but I'm just to keep myself somewhat organized, I made a list of things that I have left to do at this point. So I need to add one injector bank. I need to cut and splice the engine coolant temperature sensor, idle air control connector, move the air intake temperature sensor, so there's one wire on it that needs to be lengthened. I need to cap a spare wire that was in the connector to the oil pressure sensor. I believe that isn't needed for the Dodge. Need to add the automatic transmission connector, the neutral safety switch, and add the output shaft sensor. So today I got the injector bank, automatic transmission connector, neutral safety switch connector, and the output shaft speed sensor connector removed from the Durango harness, and tomorrow I'll probably begin installing them, which will involve drilling the backside of the PCM connectors because there are blank spots that are filled in with solid plastic right now. So I'll have to drill those out so I can get the wires in. But definitely coming along. So right now I'm getting ready to add the extra injectors and the automatic transmission components to the TJ PCM connectors. They're mostly going to be going into this white connector here. You can see all these ports that don't have anything in them. They have a solid piece of plastic blocking them, and that keeps debris from getting in to the unused ports and keeps everything nice and watertight in there. So in order to get a wire in there, we'll have to drill them out, and I'm going to be using an 1/8 inch drill bit to do that. And if this was just a flat piece of plastic, that would be simple enough. But if you look at the connector that I destroyed, you see each one of these blanks has a nipple sticking out of it like this. So once I drill through all the way to the front side of it, right here, this little piece falls off and becomes really difficult to extract. So I'm going to have to take apart the connector so that I'm able to drill through and pull them out. So I've got the TJ connector removed from the plywood just to make it a little easier to work with. And what I did before doing that was put pieces of electrical tape around the wires that I had laid out in each area just to keep its general shape, so that after I get the connector drilled out, it'll be pretty easy to put it back up and have everything else lay out back where I had it originally. To disassemble this connector, the first thing that I'll do is look at the blue safety lock tab right here. Just going to push that inward so that the two prongs on this side are facing out. You see the two blue prongs right there. And then to separate the outer housing of the connector from the inner portion, you need to release the clip on this side and on this side. So might be difficult to see, but basically I'll just take this flat screwdriver in here. There's a little slot right here where I'll push it in, just slowly pry it up, working back and forth from side to side so that this comes out as even as possible. There you go. It's all disconnected now. See the blue locking plate, I guess you could call it, inside of the housing. Definitely very important to make sure not to bend any of these prongs, because if that happens they'll need to be replaced. This white connector is labeled as the C2 connector for the PCM, and all of these pin locations that are highlighted in blue will need to be drilled out. So the way I'm doing this is an 1/8 inch drill bit chucked into the drill, and I wrapped some electrical tape around the drill bit, maybe 3/8 of an inch from the tip, to keep the drill bit from going in too far and destroying the plastic prongs that hold the pins in place. And that's basically just the depth gauge that I'm using. Figured out how deep to set it by drilling the first one carefully and figuring out how far the bit needs to go in to just barely drill out enough. I'm going to drill out pin B21 right now, which is the overdrive solenoid control. Really doesn't take much to do this, just going through, and I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pins that I'm drilling out on this. So these little black pieces are left in all of the holes that were drilled out. So what I'm doing to remove those is using this pick. I'm just pushing it up through the back, which then drives the plastic piece out the front, and then they go flying. I'm just going to go back through the list of the pinouts that are highlighted and make sure I got all of them, and I'll put the front face of the connector back on to protect the pins that are in here, and once that's back on, the new pins can be slid in place. So from there I just ended up repinning the TJ harness up onto the cardboard again, added the circuits that need to be added, the wiring that needed to be added, and adjusted a few of the lengths of the connectors. And I pretty much left it like that. So it was a very rough harness. Wires were approximately where they needed to be, but they weren't 100% where they needed to be. From there I moved on to starting with the mechanical. So I pulled out the 4-cylinder, put in the V8, and then once the V8 was in and all set up, that's when I laid the rough wiring harness on the engine and made runs as long as they needed to be, or shortened them as they needed to be, so that the harness would look good once it's in place, rather than building it completely off the vehicle and then installing it and having it not line up quite right. So if you're still watching, thanks for staying tuned. Appreciate you watching through the whole video. Would appreciate it if you could give a thumbs up, and go ahead and subscribe to see the rest of this build series.